So, good afternoon, Dr. Brower. We're here to talk a little bit about exposure to ultrafine particles. You are a professor in the School of Population and Public Health at UBC, yes?
That's right.
Right. Thanks. So, what are the main sources of ultrafine particles and exposure to them?
Well, in urban areas, it's very clear that motor vehicles are the major source by far. And in terms of exposure, therefore, it means that those people who are spending time close to motor vehicles or close to roads will have the highest levels of exposure. So that whether that means in traffic, commuting, or people who are living, working, studying close to major roads will have the highest levels of exposure. And as you can see, the gradient in terms of distance from a roadway for ultrafine particles is quite steep. So the concentrations are very high close to roads, and they drop off very rapidly. So that zone of exposure tends to be quite close to roads, and it's a much more dramatic effect than many other pollutants that we're concerned with. This image shows differences in concentrations of ultrafine particles as a function of the site of measurement. And we can see that moving from sort of a clear background to even an urban area background to roadway measurements, or even something as like a tunnel where the vehicle exhaust is less dilute, the concentrations increase dramatically. So again, that's another signal about the impact of motor vehicles. Having said that, in some locations there are also other sources that can be very important, and there are some interesting ones. Meat cooking seems to be a particularly important source. So if you imagine a city that has many restaurants that are grilling, frying operations, that can be a particularly important source of these particles. And then also wood burning is another source that we know about that can be important during certain seasons in certain locations.
So what factors besides proximity would influence exposure?
Right, so one of the things that we always think about is since most people spend time indoors, in fact, most of your time during the day is spent indoors. We have to think about how efficiently do these particles come indoors. And ultrafine particles do penetrate indoors rather efficiently, but not as much, for example, as somewhat larger particles. So depending on the size of the ultrafine particles, somewhere around 60% of what you see outdoors will come indoors, but the tighter that the building is, whether there's air conditioning, whether there's filtration, that will affect that infiltration. So that becomes another important factor. And then even though we're sort of concerned with people, especially who are living close to major roads, also how people are commuting can be very important. And as you can see here, the type of vehicle or the mode of commuting, whether you're cycling, walking, on a bus, in a car, actually doesn't have a great difference in terms of the level of ultrafines in the air in that environment. But some of these, and cycling being the most important, it's an activity where you're actually breathing at a much higher rate. So cycling is an activity where we know that you're breathing 2, maybe as much as 4 times more air per minute. And so even if the concentration is the same, because of the fact that you're cycling, because you're exercising, you're actually breathing in more of those particles. So that's another factor that affects exposure. And you could imagine the same thing, for example, if you're running versus walking, you would have the same effect. But considering the fact that during commuting, levels can be quite high because you're right on the road, and then if you're also cycling or running alongside a road, that can increase your exposure.
And if ambient ultrafine particles are out there, and they are, how do the concentrations vary?
Yeah, so there's basically two things that we think about when we think about how do they vary. Is how do they vary over time and how do they vary sort of over space. And over time, they're quite variable. As you can see from this figure here, the concentrations can go up actually by a factor of 10 or so, just from one day to the next, or even over an hourly basis. So there's two things that we think about when we think about how they vary, both how do they vary over space and how do they vary over time. You can see from this figure here that the levels of particles can vary quite a lot over the course of the day, and typically we see highest levels during high traffic periods. But there's also meteorologic conditions when we have a lot of sunlight and we have photochemical production. We can also see high levels of ultrafine particles. Over space, ultrafine particles really vary quite dramatically, and again, this has to do primarily with this proximity to roadway effect. So the locations that are closer to major roads have higher levels than those that are farther away. But if you actually look at how these sort of patterns vary over time, those patterns are stable. So meaning that a site that tends to be high always tends to be high, a site that tends to be low always tends to be low. But we do have a lot of just variability in the absolute levels within an urban area.
So what relevance does that have to individuals' exposure over the course of a day?
Right. So the important things to then consider are both the level that we've already discussed, what is the level of ultrafine particles, and then how much time people are spending under those different conditions. And so we know that the majority of time, the most common environment where people spend time is actually indoors in their own home. And then looking there, it really depends whether or not there is an indoor source of ultrafine particles. So without a source, primarily what we're seeing indoors is in the outdoor air, how much of it, that 60 to 65% or so that comes indoors. If we are producing ultrafine particles, any kind of combustion process, if we're burning candles, if we're cooking, that will lead to, or smoking, those will lead to very high levels indoors. And again, depending on how long we undertake those activities, that can be a major source of exposure. But the interesting one is commuting. And commuting, even though it's a very short amount of time, because the levels are so high, that can be, under some situations, the most important activity leading to exposure. So it depends how long you're commuting and what mode you're commuting, but that could in the end be the most important in terms of exposure.
Well, you've answered all the questions very well.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Good.